Howdy folks, this is yet another demo video in the series on web development with Rails and Git. Today I'm going to expand on what I talked about last time, which was how to use Rails model classes to save, store data, and manage a database. In this one I'm going to kind of expand on that to show how to add input validations and also how to add automated tests for those. Before I dive in to the sort of tasks you might want to complete, let's quickly review the Rails architectural diagram to kind of get a handle on where we're at here. So again, we're focused in on the model, working with the model, and so one of the things we're going to be doing today is adding input validations. So whenever a controller, for example, or a test also tries to add or update data in the model, if we add input validations, that's a way for the model to make sure that the data that gets entered is valid. And so that's the place where we basically defend the quality of our data in our databases at the model by adding these validations. And so, for example, if a test tries to save some data that is somehow invalid with respect to our validations, the model will reject it. The other thing we'll be working on today is the tests, and so we'll be talking about how to code up the tests, which you can run pre-deployment on your model to make sure they're working. And so tests are particularly important in interpreted languages like Ruby because you're not running the compiler all the time to do at least one set of error checks. And so, for example, you can introduce stupid little syntactic bugs into your scripts, and if you haven't run tests to catch them, you might not otherwise notice them, and they might wind up deployed, which would be bad. So, as I said, the first thing we're going to do is add some input validations. These are basically checks to keep bad data out of your database. So we're going to add them using the validates method. Now, again, the Rails guides are your friend here. And so if we go to the guides and you go to the index, you can see there's a whole section on active record input or active record validations. And so you have, this will talk about how to do validations, and it also show you a whole host of different sorts of ones you can do. Things like, is something present? Is it a number? Or qualities of the number, like is it less than a value? Is it greater than a value? If it's a string, how long is it? Things like this. So there's lots of different ones, and so you, on your own, you'll want to familiarize yourself with them. Or if there's something you know you want to do as a validation, you can look around in there for it. So right now I'm going to add some input validations to my model class. And so, by the way, you can see quickly a little example here. The very first thing they show you is some person model class, and it shows you, okay, what you're going to do when you add a validation is just going to add a line to your model class, which is an invocation of the validates helper or whatever it is method. And you're going to specify the type. It's basically calling this is going to enter in the type of validation you're doing. And so you're doing it, for example, on the name attribute, and you're saying that it must be present. So actually, let's go ahead and, for ours, we'll just use the presence validation, which is a fairly simple one. It just requires that there is some non-empty, non-white space, non-empty value for that thing. So that is to say, it can't be nil, and it also can't just be space. I believe that's it. And it also can't be empty string. I'm still have the WAP project opened here, basically continuing directly from the last demo, and I still have my code editor open here. And so let's open up our model class. So app, models, multiple choice question. And let's, I'll just steal this validates line. So there's we're adding an input validation. Now we have to choose an attribute, and so we don't have a name attribute. We have answer, distractors, ID, question. so on. So let's say that the not questions, but question. So let's say we have to have a question. We have to have an answer. And we should maybe have at least distractor 1, but maybe later we'll allow there to be we'll maybe allow there to be only one distractor. And so, for example, if you want to do like a true-false question, then the answer would be either true or false, and the distractor would be the opposite. But you wouldn't need the other distractors, so it kind of gives us a way to allow that. So these need to be present, and so that's what this should be enforcing now by adding that. We'll go ahead and relaunch the Rails console in order to test this out. And so here I am, and I'll say Rails in my project on the VM, and I'll say Rails console. Okay, there's the console. And now let's, just to illustrate this, let's attempt to create a model object with an invalid attribute using the class method create. And so the command should fail. So I'll just go ahead and say I tried to pass it an empty string for question. So say I tried to do that. So this should be invalid because question is blank. And I'm not even going to fill out the other distractors. I'm just going to do like that. And so what you can see here happened is it began transaction, but then it did a rollback, which indicates that this was not saved. And so, for example, we can inspect the database to confirm that there is no record in there like this. And so these are the 3 questions we previously seeded the database with, but you can see there is no 4th question in there. So it did not get added as we would expect. It got rejected. We can also, so the interesting thing is we can also inspect to see if it was successful by using the errors method. So you have a few options here. And of course, I foolishly didn't save this in a, let me run it again and save it in a variable. So this is I'll just call it Q1. Okay, so there, so it again failed again. And so now I can say Q1 and I can say .errors.any question mark. And so this will return true or false if there were errors. So true if there were, false if there weren't. And in this case, notice it says true. I have some errors. So that's one way to reveal if your save failed, is there would be, it now shows errors. I can also look at the number of errors. So I can say errors.count. And oh, it says I have 1 error, okay? And then I can even inspect some full messages, so errors.full messages. And then you see they only get 1 message, so they're going to be an array of messages. or array of strings, if you will. But the only message I have is question can't be blank. And so there it was. I had made the question blank, and that is the error message tells me the problem. So that's very useful. For purposes of comparison, I'll attempt to create an invalid model object using create bang. And this time an exception should get thrown. So last time no exception was thrown, the ID was nil. You get some hints here that didn't save, but no exception was thrown. And so now we'll try to do this. I'll call this one Q2 just as a different, but it's going to try to save. We're going to try to create this thing again, only this time I'm going to use a bang in there. And so so what you see here now is that the exception was thrown. It's a record invalid exception. And notice even in the little argument for it, you get that error message, question can't be blank. So it's another way to reveal errors. Again, when you're adding things to the seeds file, you always want to use this bang version, because the seeds, when it runs, if it's not throwing exceptions, you won't see that there's an error. So since we did add some validations here, and we tried them out enough to see that they work, we can go ahead and stage commit and push. So I'll exit out of the console. And so we added validations to multiple choice question. And push. Okay, and so that's a way to add input validations. Now the other thing we want to be able to do is run automated tests to make sure our stuff is working. So when you're doing automated tests, typically the first thing you need to do is add some test fixtures, which are basically just adding data that will be used in the tests. And this data can get used by a bunch of tests, so it's kind of a convenient thing to do. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add that test data, and we'll do that in a YAML file, which is in the test fixtures subfolder. And so these we're just going to make these representative of a typical record, and not include anything that we would think would fail an input validation. So like I said, that's down in test, and it's in models. Oh no, we're doing fixtures. It's in fixtures, and then here it is, multiple choice questions. So you can see the sort of thing they give you here is it's got its own little YAML language, and it's supposed to just make things simple. So this is going to be the name we're going to refer to each of these records with. So we'll just call it, ONE1 and TWO2. And then we can fill in some string data, and notice you don't even have to put it, or you actually shouldn't really put it in quotes, you just type it right out here. So for purposes of demonstration, I guess I'll just use a question I've used before. So what does the M in MVC stand for? And the answer is model, not mode, not min, not moon, and not mine. And what does the V in MVC stand for? Stands for view, not viz, not vice, not guest, not vehicle. Okay. Okay, so there's some example data for us, which will be used in our fixtures. And so since we've gone ahead and created that, we can commit it. And again, frequent commits being considered a good practice. So git add -a, added test fixtures for multiple choice question. Okay. Oh yeah, push it. Okay. So now that we have some test data to play with, let's go ahead and add a test for a typical valid model object. So this is kind of like the sanity check test. So if we just want to make a normal object, how do we do it? And so the first thing we need to do is open in our code editor the appropriate unit test file in the test models subfolder. So we're in the test subfolder here. We scroll down, there's the models subfolder right there. And if we look in there, we see multiple choice question right here. And you see what it gives you. Well, it's got the annotations up here, which is meant to be helpful. And then also it even has a commented out example of how to write one of these things, which is sort of a nice little thing they did when they generated it. And so let's create a new empty test case that we're just going to make an empty one that will test that a valid record should be saved without error. So so we'll call this test, and then the test is kind of an interesting way they do this. So we use a string, and so we'll say, I'm going to say multiple choice question should be valid. We'll call it that. And again, I'm just copying this form up here. So we say do, and we say end. And we'll get to the middle next, what goes in the middle here. So first thing we want to do is make the test case retrieve one of our fixture objects, which we know to be a valid object. And so, so we can just make a local variable 1, and then this is something where I'll bop over to the Rails guides and remind myself what the correct syntax for pulling from there is. So so testing Rails applications, we want to go there. And fixtures, I'll take a look at fixtures. Yeah, so what we do is you use the name of the database table, and then you can use the symbol that corresponds to that name you entered here, like 1 or first or whatever. So, so yeah, it's multiple choice questions. And look, I even get an autocomplete. Who would have thought? And then I'll just grab question 1. Okay, so that's that step. And so next, let's make the test case check that the object is valid. And so there's we're going to use a combination of things here. We're going to use the assert method, which is basically it says assert. You can translate as make sure this is true. Whatever follows is true. So it's going to be a Boolean thing, and it needs to be true. If it comes back false, that means something unexpected happened, and the test will fail. If it comes back true, that means things happened as expected and everything's good. So, and we're going to use the valid question mark method on our object. So valid will cause the, checking the validity of an object will cause the validations to run and check it. And so So we're basically, we just get one of our normal objects and we just make sure it's valid, and if it is, then we should have assurance that things are working, at least nominally. So the next thing we need to do is run the tests, and we'll just run all our tests. There are ways to run specific tests, but I just kind of like running them all. So let's just say Rails test. Okay, this is a stupid little annoyance. It wants, one thing Rails wants to do, this pops up a bit, is it wants to generate controller tests, and I changed things around since this got generated, so it assumes that it'll anyway, it's a bug just because it automatically generated this, and I didn't want to. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment it out like that, save it, and so I've just basically removed all my controller tests, which we'll learn about in some future demo anyway. And so let me try that again. Okay, there we go. So so it ran our tests. There was one assertion, which is just the one we added a minute ago, and no failures, no errors, no skips. So it ran all the tests. And so since we have one test case in there that we're happy with, we can go ahead and add it. To the repo. Okay. That's maybe have been a little more meaningful of a log message, but I'll leave it at that. Okay, so that was kind of our baseline like sanity check test. So now let's actually test to make sure our input validations are working by feeding in an invalid model object and making sure that our input validations catch that it's invalid. So first thing, again, let's create an empty test case that we'll use to test one of these. And so here I am back in the multiple choice questions test file, and I'm going to add another test, and this one is going to be let's do question must be present. Yeah, we'll do that one. Call it that. All right. And so first thing we'll do is we'll use our fixtures by pulling an object out of the fixture. And so we can do this basically the same way we did it up above. And next, we're going to reset it though to be an invalid value. So we got pulled our valid object from our fixtures. So that was one. Recall it looked like this. It was the what does M stand for in MVC. And now we're going to change it around to make it invalid. So I'm going to say I'm going to set the question to, I'm going to just set it to nil. I could also send it to an empty string, which would also be invalid. Last, I'm going to make the test case check that the object is invalid. So it's a little different than last time. and actually I didn't write this slight bug in the instructions here, so I shouldn't be using assert. I shouldn't be using, oh no, I guess I have invalid. So you have a couple ways to do this. Maybe. Is invalid one? There's also assert not, which would be valid. I'm not sure if invalid is actually a method. I think I'm going to go with the way I'm familiar with, although this might also be valid, might also be the legal way to do it. So I'm going to say assert not one dot valid. And so having put that in there, we just go ahead and run the test to see if it works, or see what comes out if our tests run. Okay, so we see the tests ran. There were 2 runs, 2 assertions, no failures, no errors, no skips. So our input validations are working. And again, the key difference here is that between the assert, this one we expect this to be true, so we assert it. This one we expect it to not be true, so we assert not. And the assert, again, is basically you expressing what you expect to happen, and the test will pass if what you expect does actually happen. If something unexpected happens, then the test fails, and in that way you can catch things. So we're happy with this, so let's go ahead and stage commit and push it. And now let's go ahead and see how you can, a little more example of how this actually works to help you catch bugs, or how these automated tests help you catch bugs. So the purpose of this part is really just to illustrate how these test cases are useful, because you might actually accidentally introduce a bug into your code. And so, so we want to be able to catch those bugs before we deploy our system or demonstrate it for somebody to have it crash. And so tests are a key way to help you do that. So we'll try a couple of them. We'll first just catch a syntax error. And so to demonstrate how this would work, let's just introduce a syntax error in our model class. So I'll reopen the model class, app, model, multiple choice question. And what if I just, what if I did something crazy, like I accidentally entered true instead of true here? And so note, again, there's the only way this mistake will get caught is if this file executes. And so one of the ways you can make sure it gets executed and we catch that error is by having a test case for it. I'll point out that both of these test cases use multiple choice question model objects, so this code should execute when any of these runs. And so so if we run all the tests, one or more of our tests should fail. So I'm going to say Rails test. I did save that, right? Yes. Okay. Rails test. And so now you can see there's exceptions being thrown, and it gives us a clue. It says that it's in the multiple choice question test code. It's the one that has the name question should be valid, and it basically says undefined local variable or method true. And then it even says, did you mean true? And then it even shows you in the stack trace where the exception was thrown, and so you can see it's in multiple choice questions, line 17. And so if we go and look at line 17 of multiple choice questions, indeed that is the line where we made our mistake. So let's just go ahead and undo that change using the get checkout method we saw previously. And we can see our change should have been removed, and indeed it was. It's back to true. So that's just an example of how these help you catch syntax errors. We can also catch logic errors. So these are ones that aren't syntax errors, but still are the sort of things that you want your tests to be testing for. So let's introduce a logic error in the input in one of the input validations. And so maybe our logic error was simply that we forgot to make sure that questions were present, or forgot to add a validation that questions are present. Or maybe we accidentally deleted it. So now if we run our tests again, we see yet another failure. Now it looks a little different. So notice there's a slight difference between when tests fail. So the code didn't crash, the test just didn't work, or the things didn't happen as expected in the test. So notice this time we only have one test popping up, which is the test question must be present test, which was specifically testing that there was a validation there that was working. And what happened is, if we look at the code here, so it's this test. What happened was we set the question to nil, and then we said this should not be valid. But because we have no validation now to test for this or check for this, it did come back as valid. And so then the assertion failed and said something unexpected has happened here. You better go look at it. And so, and it even gives a little message here: expected true to be nil or false. And down below in the stats, you can see there was one failure. Probably in the previous one, notice it said one failure, but also one error in the last time, because we actually had a syntax error that would, the test code is just code itself, and so if there are syntax errors, it's going to, crash the way code crashes when there's syntax errors. In this case, there was no syntax error, but again, things just did not happen the way it was supposed to happen, and so the test failed. Yeah, and so that concludes this. We can just go ahead and, like we did before, just undo that change and see that we're all up to date and see that it's now been restored. All right, and so that concludes this video. I hope it was helpful.